Okay, so for this recording, right, I want to focus on actually book 6, right, which is SOL and its indicators, right. So if you look at book 6, right, it's actually split into two parts, right. The first one is part 1. So part 1 runs from page 1 to page 36. So then, of course, at the bottom end of 36, you have tutorial questions for that particular part 1 lah, right? So for today's lesson, right, or at least for this recording, I want to do stuff related to just part 1 alone. Okay, because anyway, the SLS packages are also separate lah, right? Okay, so we start off with part 1 first, right? So I want to do two things actually. The first thing is to give you an overview of what part 1 is, meaning pages 1 to 36, and what the content is lah, right? So that's for this recording, and then after that, in a separate video, I'll go through the CSQ questions, right? They're actually two very short questions lah, so I have slides for that, so we'll do that as well. Okay, so we'll start with the overview first. Okay, so this topic is called SOL and its indicators, right? And largely speaking, this is broken into two parts, right? So the large majority of the book, about 85% of the part 1, centers on two things. One, why GDP is good, is a good measure, of something called standard of living, right? And then just like how GDP is a good measure of SOL, there are also arguments for why GDP is not a good measure of SOL, right? So this covers about 85% of the part 1, meaning pages 1 to 36. And when I say 85%, right, actually most of the questions test on this, at least the basic ones are. Okay, so we will talk about this, but most questions test on this, meaning actually our tutorial formulation is also like that, right? So we actually have two questions on this, right? The first one is what I will go through with you later in the other video, which is CSQ question 1B. Is a 10-mark CSQ question, right? So that's on page 27. That tests you on why GDP is a good measure, and then why GDP is not a good measure of SOL, right? And then the second part, essay question 1B, essay question 1 lah, actually there's only one question there, which is the 15-mark question. That's on page 28. That essay question also tests you on this, right? So you can see actually in terms of the questions they said, most of them center around this red color point lah. Okay, of course there are variants lah. I guess when we go to J2, I'll tell you about the variants, right? Okay, so 85% of page 1 to 36 talks about these two things: why it's a good measure and why it's not a good measure of something called living standards. Then there are others, right? So then there's the rest of the 15%. So the rest of the 15%, right, covers firstly the definition of GDP. So we'll talk about this, of GDP, right? It talks about real GDP and different conceptions of GDP. There's real GDP, there's nominal GDP, and then there's of course GDP per capita. So we'll talk about more about what this is basically, right? And then also they also mention something called the Human Development Index. So HDI stands for the Human Development Index, right? So 15%, right, is going to be on this, right? And I mean on this, meaning it's also very testable lah, right? So I've seen questions that ask you for the definition of GDP, and questions that test you on the real, nominal / GDP per capita, and then also questions on the Human Development Index. So that's why I picked out these things to highlight. Okay, so on page 1 to 36, to just give you an overview, 85% of it talks about why GDP is a good measure, and then why GDP is not a good measure, right? And we will go through this in CSQ 1B and EQ 1, and then the rest of the 15% of page 1 to 36 covers these three things lah, right? These three things are the more testable ones. Okay, Okay, so I wanna, because the next video I wanna talk about is CSQ 1B. So for this video, I want to talk about just the 50%. Okay, so we'll talk about the definition of GDP, real GDP, nominal GDP, and GDP per capita. The Human Development Index, I will talk about it when I talk about maybe CSQ 1B or even essay question 1. We'll see how it goes. Okay, and so I want to just talk about the green color stuff today, now. So, GDP, what GDP is, nominal GDP, real GDP, as well as GDP per capita. Okay, so we start off with the first thing, which is the definition of GDP. So I'm going to move this thing down. Okay, so what is the definition of GDP? Okay, so I'll give you the standard definition first. You can see in your notes, okay? Mine might be a bit different, but it's the same. Okay, so GDP stands for something called gross domestic product. Right, so it's okay. I'll give you the definition first. So the gross domestic product of a country is the total monetary value of all final goods and services. I better put it in full. Goods and services are produced within the geographical boundary of a country. Geographical boundary of a country in a given period of time. Okay, so that's the definition for GDP. Okay, so this is like very complicated, right? So what exactly is it saying? What this is saying is that imagine you have a country, right? So let's say you have this country. Okay, let's call this country Singapore, and then this is the boundary of, this black color line is the boundary of Singapore. So in Singapore there are various factors of production, right? And so whenever you collect all the factors of production in Singapore, then you say how many goods and services can all the factors of production within this geographical boundary produce, right? So let's say in Singapore, we have a lot of factors of production, so hence we can produce 3 squares, right? So gross domestic product is the total monetary value of all final goods and services produced within the geographical boundary. So I've addressed geographical boundary, right? So anything within this black color boundary, it's Singapore. Then anything that Singapore that this black color boundary produces, that's counted within GDP. So it's a total value. Okay, so every country will produce squares and like circles, right? So you cannot sum up squares and circles. What you do is you sum up their monetary values, right? So $2. If the square is $2, then this is $2, $2, and this is $3, and then this is $3. So what you do is you can't sum up squares and circles, otherwise you get a list, right? So what you do is just add all the monetary value. So 2, 2, 2, 3, 3. So that's equals to, how much is this? $12. Right. So monetary value. So this is the total monetary value of all goods and services, right? So the square, first square, second square, third square, first circle, second circle, that's all the goods and services produced, right? And then you sum up then you get the $12. That's the GDP of Singapore. Okay. The thing I want to really highlight about this is that people always get the definition wrong, and the biggest mistake is this word, the word final. Right, let me change this to, can I change the color? Oh great, I can. Okay, so this word, right, people always place it at the wrong place, right? So usually they will put it like in place of total here, right? So they will say it's the final monetary value. It's not, right? It's actually the total monetary value of all final goods and services produced within the geographical boundary. And there's a reason why you want to choose the word. There's a reason why this word is very, very important. Firstly, because people always get it wrong, right? So from an exam perspective, these people always get it wrong, right? But there's a second reason, right? So let's say, right, in Singapore, Singapore first produced this small square, and the value of this small square is $2, right? But then the thing is that the small square is used as a factor of production to produce this bigger square that you then sell for $4, right? And then this, imagine this bigger square is also again used as a factor of production to produce this even bigger square that's worth $6. So actually, what is the GDP of Singapore? It's not 2 plus 4 plus 6, right? Because if you do so, because embedded within this $6 is this $4. And embedded within this $4 is actually this $2. So if you go and plus 2 plus 4 plus 6, you actually double count. So what you do is you just count the $6. Right. So that's why it must be the final goods and services, and not just all goods and services, because some goods and services go on to become factors of production in other goods and services. And so you should only count the value of the final good or service. Okay, so don't mess this up. Okay, don't place this one wrongly. So be careful lah. Just put a note there. Make sure you be careful with the placement of this word. But more importantly, this word, you have to be careful because otherwise it changes the meaning of the definition lah. Okay, so that's the definition. And this is what GDP is. Okay, you're measuring the total output of all FOPs within this geographical boundary that is the country. Okay, so that's the first one. Definition of GDP, I'm done. So let's check this off. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is this concept of real versus nominal GDP. So we'll talk about this. Let's shift this out. Real versus nominal GDP. So what exactly is this real versus nominal? Okay, so imagine, right, you have a country, let's say Singapore, right, and Singapore in 2010 produces, let's say, 3 squares, right, and then each square is, let's say, $2, right. And then in 2011, for example, Singapore also produces 3 squares, right, but now the 3 squares, each one is worth now $3. So Singapore's GDP in 2010 is $6, right? Whereas Singapore's GDP in 2011 is $9. If you just sum up the monetary value lah, right? Okay, if you just sum up the monetary value, what you're doing is you're summing up the GDP and in that particular year's prices. So if in 2011 the prices are $3, then you just sum up all the $3 lah, right? This number here, these two yellow numbers, these are your nominal GDP numbers. Okay, it's when you use the current year's prices. Okay, this nominal GDP is it's not great. We actually don't like to use nominal GDP. We don't like, right? And most CSQs give you real instead. But it's actually important for you to know the distinction between real and nominal lah. So what's the difference? Why don't we like to use nominal GDP? And the reason why is because the numbers paint a picture that distorts reality. Okay, imagine I just give you the numbers, right? So you don't see what's happening in the background. Imagine you don't see all of this, right? So you see, 2011 you got $9 in GDP. 2010 you got $6. So it seems to suggest that your country is producing more, right? But why is this fake? The reason why it's fake is because if you look at the actual situation, right? In 2010 and 2011, we produced the same amount of goods and services, which is 3 squares basically, right? What's distorting the picture is this price change, right? That nominal GDP includes, but real GDP does not. So what's the definition of real GDP? It is GDP. So what you want to do is you want to define GDP first, right? Okay, and then you say that real GDP measures only the change in output. and not the change in prices, and it removes the effects of inflation. Inflation is basically price changes lah. Okay, that one we will go through when I get to inflation. Okay, so how do you measure real GDP? The way you do it is in the notes they'll give you some GDP deflator, right? In the notes you read, they'll mention something about a GDP deflator, but I won't go into that. Okay, what actually happens, or in a more simple way, what you do is it removes the effects of inflation by keeping the prices constant with reference to something called a base year. So what you do, right, is you set a particular year to be something called the base year. Right? Then you say, okay, let's say I want to keep 2010 as a base year. Then what we want to do is you say, if 2010 is the base year, then I want to keep the prices of all subsequent years to be equal to that of the prices in 2010. What this means is you say, hey, this is $3, right? But this $3 is 2011's prices. I don't like that. So I'm going to change it. I remove the effects of inflation by changing these prices to the prices at 2010, which is $2. So if you do so, right, then this number becomes 6. Right? And what's so awesome about this number is that this 6 is equals to this. And just by looking at the number, you get a better sense of reality, which is that in 2010 and 2011, the economy produced 3 squares and output did not change. Okay? So that's okay. So what I say all this, right? What do you need to know? You need to know what's the definition of real versus nominal, which is here. Okay, you can be tested on this. It's a very long definition, but it's worth memorizing lah, just in case. Okay, so that's the first thing you need to know. The second thing you need to know, which is inside your notes as well, but it's parked in some box, right, is the formula. Okay, real GDP growth is equals to the nominal GDP growth minus the inflation rate. So all these figures are all in percentage terms. Cambridge has tested this before. This formula before. Okay, so what exactly is this formula? So nominal GDP growth incorporates the effects of the change in output as well as the change in prices. Right, so it actually has 2 items captured within the percentage figure lah. Right, inflation rate is the change in the prices. Okay. So if you take the square and the dollar minus the dollar, then what you get is just a change in the squares alone, which is real GDP growth. So what this measures is, from year to year, was there a change in the number of squares that the economy produced? So if this number is positive, then you know that, okay, the number of squares you produce basically has increased. Okay, so I'm done with that. Our last item on the list is something called GDP per capita. This is very easy. What is GDP per capita? You will see this measure in case studies. They won't actually ask you, but you need to know what it means. GDP per capita, because different countries have different sizes, right? So naturally, a big country like China will have a much larger GDP. But it doesn't mean that the citizens there are better off than citizens in Singapore, right? I think in general, we do have higher incomes. And the reason why is because you must take GDP divided by the total population. Right? So it makes sense, right? If one country has 10 squares, but there are 10 people, then each person only get 1 square. Right? So if there are 10 squares, but there are 10 people, then each person is 1 person, 1 square, right? But then if there are 100, okay, but then if the other economy has 5, let's say the other economy has 6 squares, but there's only 2 people, then each person has 3 squares. So this is GDP per capita. You take the number of squares, the GDP, divided by the total population here. right? So then this gives you a better metric of how many squares each person is enjoying, which is what essentially we want to figure out when we talk about using this to gauge something called living standards.